projects that aren't in the foundation, how do we define when a project is sufficiently dependent upon that it's falling apart in some way, or us intervening and providing mentorship and getting them to a healthy place is worth it for us? And then two, like, I think, and this is something that's really only come up very recently, but is there a way for us to provide that mentorship, and even potentially, give them a voice inside of the TSC and the foundation in the further date without taking on the long-term liability of hosting that project forever, right? Like, could we take on a project, mentor it, and then graduate it into another foundation is another option. And it's a very interesting possibility. I don't know if it's actually a possibility yet, but it would get us out of a lot of problems, right? Like, we wouldn't have to be taking on a lot of long-term liabilities. We would disconnect the mentorship program from it definitely being a future quote-unquote top-level project in the Node Foundation. Three, it gets us out of picking winners, right? Like, we're only picking which projects need our help for a short amount of time. And then once they are healthy, they live in another foundation. And that foundation hopefully does not have policies where it's king-making and, picking winners. And yeah, okay. So that was all that I had to say about that quick brain dump there.
Michael, I really like your last point about not picking winners. I think there's a danger with accepting a lot of projects as top-level projects that stay there forever. It's kind of like, I know that Node Core is separate from the TSC is responsible for more than Node Core. At least this is what we're talking about here. But there's a risk that users will perceive top-level projects as a kind of a standard library that is safer to use than things that are not inside that. And that's going to end up, over time, if there's if there ends up being 30 projects that are all top level that are there forever, then those are going to be winners, right? Those are going to be things we've picked, we've blessed forever.
I mean, I agree with I agree that our goal is not to pick winners. I'm not sure though, whether this really is relevant for the thing Rod's trying to do, which is more delineate what the foundation should concern itself with. Well, yeah, so let's leave it at that. I also, in a way, the goal of the foundation is to make projects or modules, whatever packages, more healthy if they come in a top-level project, right? So in a way, they maybe actually do become safer if they become part of the foundation. What would be the point if it didn't do anything to make it better?
Well, so I think that to some extent we don't want to involve ourselves this directly in anything that could potentially just not be our problem to deal with. So the way that I would put it is that if we were Python, would this be in our standard library? Has this reached a market share among our users that it would end up in the standard library if we were not a small core ecosystem, right? Because at that point, it's our problem even if we try to ignore it. If it actually ends up in a bad place, it affects enough of our users that we do need to care about it. That does not mean necessarily that we need to host it indefinitely. That does not mean necessarily that we need to bless it as something like a standard library and discourage anybody else from ever doing another alternative. Is there a way in which we can kind of have our cake and eat it too here, where we intervene in projects that are critical, but we avoid blessing them or taking them on long term?
And I think to both you and Ferris's point is that this is concerned of perception as much as anything else. If we accept one of these projects as a TLP, it can be viewed as we are, not only is this a winner, but it's we're signing off technically on it. At least people have that perception that it implies we have technically vetted these projects and said these are the same technical quality as Node, when that's not exactly the role here. At least that's my interpretation of it.
I agree with you, Brian.
Right, and say that we had something right now in the project lifecycle document, we have some metrics for health, diversity of companies that are on the TC, like being geolocated in different time zones. Like these are things that we are saying this is a healthy project that you can probably rely on in a way that you can't rely on a project that just has a single maintainer. But other projects could fall under that criteria that are not inside of our foundation. So if we want to encourage other projects to become healthy that we're not wanting to take on responsibility for, we probably want to like open up these definitions and these restrictions and whatever this kind of certification quote unquote thing looks like, and allow anybody to get to that place, right?
It's also worth noting that something that is critical to the ecosystem today might not be in like a few years or in 5 years, right? So like saving it today would still be a worthwhile thing, making it healthy again. But yeah, you don't want to necessarily like do that forever when something else has come along that's better and people are, are switching to that. You want to like let it die over time, I think.
So what I was saying, I want to keep on coming back to this idea of a contested space of ideas, because that's where we have the most productive discussion. We all bring our different opinions back to what Bert was saying about, is it small core, is it not? Like, I don't think we should actually even define that, because that depends on the different perspectives that come to the project. And I'm gonna fight for small core, but I know others aren't. And that's actually a healthy discussion to have. And we should continue having that discussion. So I don't want to write all those things down. But if we leave it as this generic idea that we're responsible for fostering a healthy ecosystem, then we can have that discussion. What does it mean to be healthy? And we might be able to come up with policies, or we might be able to look at different action plans on the basis of what that means to be healthy. And that might include, for example, investing in some evangelism around healthy open source projects, getting out there and creating materials, reaching out. And it could just be using our resources to promote healthiness of projects, not actually using the foundation to adopt them or anything else. So it's just the action is sort of undefined, and the exact interpretation of what it all means is also undefined, but the vague idea is there. Does that make sense?
I like what you wrote.
Yeah. So I think that this group has a really hard time visualizing what these definitions and scopes are without concrete examples. So I'm just going to throw a few things out there to kind of prime this discussion. So one is NAN, which the CTC, like a while back, basically unanimously agreed just needs to come into the core project and be there. But it is distributed entirely in the ecosystem. It does not ship with Node. It is a third party. There could potentially be competitors someday. If you look at the download and dependency statistics, it's comparable to Express, actually. But then you compare that with a module like Request, and Request has something like 3 times as many downloads and dependencies. So you get into these really interesting things where there is a lot of subjectivity to these definitions. And even the things that we really can all agree to, I have a very hard time quantifying with any kind of metric. So I'm wondering what other people kind of think about that.
Well, on NAN, we have a dependency for how you write native modules, right? That's a core part of the functionality. So I think the fact that we have a dependency on it is an important metric.
We don't have a dependency on NAN. I mean, core doesn't depend on NAN. People depend on NAN. And roughly as many people depend on NAN as depend on Express right now. If you look at
writing native modules without NAN, it's a nightmare. I mean, Node, the native module story for Node would be hugely flawed without NAN.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm not really sure where we sit on things there. I mean, I think we've effectively blessed NAN, or at least that was probably like the actual intent there. So like people would write stuff that isn't binding directly to V8 because that's a nightmare. But yeah, I'm not really sure. Word.
No, like this is my point though, right? Everybody agrees subjectively that this needed to happen and that it was a good idea. But it's very hard to actually define an objective difference between something like NAN and something like Express, even though we know that they're wildly different. I mean, we agreed that Express was important enough for us to intervene, but the delta between Express and NAN that we all know subjectively is very big. But I'm trying to find any kind of metric that we can quantify that with. I mean, even if you look at something like, oh, well, you know, native is part of the story of what ships with Core. Well, Core ships with the native API, the native V8 API. There are, you know, there was more than one other abstraction to NAN. I know that TJ Fontaine was working on one, and we effectively blessed a different one because enough people were depending on it. Node also ships, but then take it back, right? Node ships with an HTTP API. Express is like a layer above that that's dependent on roughly at the same level as NAN is. What's the difference there? Like we have a subjective difference in all of our heads about that. But how, like, I can't quantify it.
And libuv makes another different problem as well.
Yeah. I think like the thing with like I don't really know how to quantify that entirely either, but like all of Express is almost certainly not going to break in like a major version of Node, but potentially all of your native add-on layer is going to just, you know, not be usable at all.
Yeah, but the point is that it's not necessarily the only way to go. At the moment, it's the only reasonable way to go. TJ's thing never matured, so it was never really an option. But that doesn't discount the possibility that maybe somebody forked NAN, or maybe somebody will come up with a different alternative. And here we are holding a thing that we're essentially blessing. So it is actually the same sort of problem. It's just that the current situation is a bit different.
It might be worth thinking a little bit about why a project would want to join the foundation. Like, what did NAN gain? I'm actually not sure what I wasn't part of that discussion, but like why was NAN like interested in folding into like joining the foundation, and why is Express, and why would other projects in the future be interested in doing that? Like what are they hoping to gain, and what can the foundation offer them?
Well, I think Express was in a situation where it wasn't going to be able to fix its governance problems without being inside of a neutral body. So that was the reason why it needed to come to the foundation rather than just on its own adopt other governance processes. So it needed the mentorship and it needed the neutral body in order to move forward. I think NAN really just joined for other procedural reasons in order to get it closer to Core.
Yeah. So
yeah.
a big thing for NAN was to, at least to some degree, have a more involvement there, so that we could, so like when a major release of Node comes out, like even before that, basically we need to make a release of NAN, and it needs to line up very closely so that people's native modules can like keep working. Otherwise, everything falls apart for all that amount of native modules that depends on NAN.
Yeah, we folded it into the release process, but we sort of now fold a lot of third-party libraries into that testing process through the Canary and the Goldmine and stuff, right? So we actually have recognized that there are other modules out there that we need to make sure that we don't break when we ship as well. The main difference between them and NAN is that the actual development of Node Core and the changes that are required in NAN are very similar and connected to each other because we're finding this native layer.
I guess one step further, we actually cause changes in NAN to be required.
But any major version bump that we do will cause changes in third-party dependencies, right?
Yeah. Whether it's not just NAN. It could be we could do a change that breaks Express at any point. We could do a change that breaks anything.
Yeah, that's true.
So I can't help but wonder if we're just thinking about this the wrong way. So if you look at the Linux Foundation as an example, the Linux Foundation is set up as this umbrella to bring in these multiple projects. Each one is independent of one another, and just because like right now, the Node is associated there, but there's also other things like this new blockchain, Hyperledger stuff. There's there's all these different projects, and they're all autonomous from one another. They all have their own governance body. There's none of this hand-wringing about how these things relate to one another when one of these other things comes in. And I'm wondering if we're if we're overthinking this problem a bit too much. That it is possible to have these additional top-level things come in at a foundation level, but still be independent of core, right? And have their own independent identity without having to say, okay, well, is core blessing this thing or not? It's just an independent thing with its own governance. It could be modeled after what we're doing here, but it's still its own independent autonomous thing, right? If we went with that model, then I think the question becomes quite a bit easier.
I think part of there's a perceptual difference between the Node Foundation and Linux Foundation, and that actually is the TSC itself. And just going back to what is the scope of the TSC, I think rightly or wrongly, there's this perception that the TSC oversees Node, and anything else associated by the TSC is just kind of almost by definition also associated with Node, because the TSC also oversees them. At least that's the impression I get from chatting with other folks.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the perception out there we need to work on improving, and literally at every level. I mean, like both on what the TSC does, what the foundation does. Also, I mean, a lot of people, even on our own board, don't really understand how well its core is doing. Like a lot of trepidation actually on the board is like, as much as we've said, contributions are growing at this rate and and have like 1 million people now working on core. The scale of health that we have around core hasn't persisted outside of this group as well as it should. I want to come back real quick to what James was saying though about how we're kind of overthinking it. I think one of the problems that we're running into, and I logged an issue about this, is that we're trying to define things as projects when that definition is really insufficient. If you look at what Apache has done, right? So Apache has a big, flat structure of all these top-level projects. They mostly scope to a single repository and a single distributed thing for every single one of those. That's like how older open source looks. No part of Node or what we even have inside of the foundation right now really fits into that structure. Like we have a very tangled web of interdependencies and independent autonomous units. Right now, there's at least 5 working groups that we could pull out of core and bring up to the top level without a lot of contention, I think. I mean, the website, documentation, evangelism, localization, like all of these groups are doing stuff that is much broader than core. Like scoping them under core has really just been a convenience and a historical artifact. But if we scope them to top level projects, like they're not actually equivalent to what is happening in the CTC and under core. So if we tie that to representation on the TSC, we get into this weird thing where not all projects really are created equal because they have a much bigger scope under them in terms of contributions and impact. And so I feel like trying to create this project hierarchy is one of the reasons why it's difficult is because it's just an insufficient way to define this.
Yeah.
And then you have the build working group, which is literally just like a one-way dependency chain from every other thing that we do. So just throw that wrench in there.
Yeah, the more I think about it, trying to just kind of stew on it over the past couple of weeks, it just seems that we are trying too hard to put a fairly arbitrary or artificial definition, or to use the word, I would use a hierarchy here in place here, where one may not necessarily need to exist. Right. It's okay for Express, for instance, to exist as a largely independent project. I mean, we want to ensure that the process and the governance there is open. There's a significant amount of value in making sure that there's that everything is transparent and modeled after what we've accomplished within core. But it doesn't have to be viewed that Express is somehow under the Node project, right? It can be a separate thing, without there being any kind of interpretation that Node Core is somehow endorsing it, right? And I
how do
think
you
the
message
other
that?
top-level projects, we can view that way as well. Go ahead, Russ. Sorry.
I think the real thing we're at right now is how do we message it outside of this group, because we seem to have a fairly good shared understanding of what we're doing. It's those outside that don't. So the board is one, but also those that we talk to. I mean, I think we're all talking to people and getting a lot of confused messages back. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of perception, and that's what we're trying to achieve here.
Right.
And I think there's something to be said about what the role of the TSC is in all of this, right? Like, if we decided to just flatten this out, right, to get rid of some of these hierarchies and really treat what is under the TSC as, a big web of interconnected components, perhaps what the role of the TSC is to check in on all these components and make sure that they're moving forward and healthy, and then reporting and communicating that both among the other components and projects, but also to the board and externally to the community.
Right.
So the hour is almost over, and I don't think we will reach sort of the final philosophical answer that answers all questions today. So what I would like to propose is actually to sort of accept Rod's 3-point thing for the time being, and if anyone has a better idea, bring it forth and we can talk about it. But at least this is something we can all share, unless there's people that really object to any of the points he suggested. Does that make sense?
I mean, I'll turn it into a PR for proper discussion, because it's pretty quick to just bring it on everyone just here.
So one thing I think that is going to happen with that PR is that people are going to have kind of knee-jerk reactions to point number 2, because we're agreeing that it's a goal because we haven't agreed on that scope yet, and so people might interpret that as being even broader in scope than what we've already taken on, rather than actually being an attempt to try and quantify and define that scope better. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, I'm just saying it just needs to be messaged really carefully.
Yeah, I think that might be a risk that we take.
Look, I'll do some messaging around that when I make a PR. I'll bounce it off you before I do it, Michael, because I understand your point. But I think what we could do is talk about, I'll put an addendum there about interpretation.
Okay, great.
Okay, I have to go and catch a plane, so I'll get to say goodbye to everyone.
Goodbye.
All right.
Thanks for the chat.
I think that's it.
Goodbye, Rod.
Bye, Rob.
Sorry, Mike.
So
what were you saying, Michael?
Are we pretty much wrapped up on today? We'll have to continue it next week.
Yeah, I mean, this is enough feedback to come up with some more concrete proposals that we can discuss. So those will turn into PRs once I start to work them out.
All right, sounds good.
Okay. Is there room for a short thing to talk about? I'm kind of curious if anyone knows what's going on with libuv mentorship in the foundation. Are there TSC meetings and that kind of stuff, or is it just
Oh,
you know.
so in the last meeting, we assigned Rod and Alexis to that. So I know that Alexis wanted to talk a little bit about that in this meeting. We've got 4 minutes, Alexis. Is that enough for you?
Well, I just started thinking about what needs to be done there, and I really wanted to get you guys' guidance, sync up with Rod and everyone. I mean, if you have 5 minutes, what I at a high level, I think steps to proceed is create a TC. There's no official TC. Let me take my notes. Then review the contribution guidelines of the docs. Then reach out to previous contributors and invite them to collaborate. And then have a couple of meetings to get everybody on the same page. This is just at a high level an idea of what practical steps we could do to make progress there.
Yeah. It's working pretty well for Express to basically do that contribution report and identify everybody who's done some work, and just kind of build out an early committer list before you start to go into like who's on the TSC and da-da-da. Like first, just build out a good committer list, discuss the process of contribution and any changes to it, and then move on to a TSC.
Yeah, that's good feedback. So also on the TSC, okay, so how do we nominate TSC then? Definitely Saul was number 1 candidate.
I would just defer it until the committer list is out, right? So the committer list can elect a TSC once there's a built-out committer list, right? And everybody who's a current committer is obviously going to be on that because they're highly engaged in the project, and they're going to be shoe-ins for the TC eventually. But it does give like people. Like if somebody's been working on documentation a lot and they were not previously a committer, it gives them a chance to be a committer and then other people to recognize that and potentially even have them on the TC. But like a prerequisite to that is just identifying all the people that have contributed, and then under a new contribution policy would be eligible to become a committer through onboarding. So you identify those people, you put up the new contribution policy, and then you start to build out the onboarding process, right? And in that first one, I imagine that you're going to learn a lot about onboarding.
Yeah, makes sense. I think they only have 4 committers. It's Ben, Fyodor, Bert, and Saul.
Right. But if you went back and looked at everybody who has contributed for the last, say, 6 months, are there more contributors than 4 people? Like, obviously only 4 people have landed anything, but has anybody, like, sent good patches in that time?
Right. So that's definitely the first thing to do, and then have them suggest and vote for the technical committee, and at the same time review the contribution guidelines, the moderation policy and all that, make sure the environment is safe and has a clear path for collaborators to become, for contributors to become collaborators and all that. We did.
Right. I have a script that does like a contribution report for GitHub, so I can post that issue if you like.
Yes, please do.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious what was going on, but I think my my question has been answered.
Great. Definitely Bert and Ben, I mean, your input is very valuable.
Yeah. I agree with like what Michael suggested. Like, it's good to identify if there's other active contributors. Although I would think that at least Ben would know.
Yeah, I know.
Well, we can look at the logs and post the statistics and go from there.
All right.
Yeah, my contribution report script actually works on an entire org now too. So I can run it on the whole libuv org, and then I'll pull in like the release tool and API docs and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
All right.
So we're at the top of the hour. Before we end the meeting, quick update on Express. We had an actual meeting on Tuesday evening, and that went fairly well, and we're getting the committer list together and stuff. So stuff is beginning to roll along, I think. I don't know if there's anything to report other than that for now. Does anyone else have anything they would like to discuss before we head off?
Nope, I think that's it.
First, then you have a couple of questions.
I think they kind of came up in the previous discussion.
Okay, so they've all been answered.
I think we have to see how the discussion about the mission statement comes out. But that was basically what I was curious about. Yeah, like
Okay.
how we define what we're trying to achieve and why projects would actually want to join the foundation.
All right, well, it seems like we're done here. Thanks everyone for coming to the meeting. And I don't know, do we have meetings every 2 weeks now? I don't remember. There might be a meeting next week. We'll play it by the issues, I guess.
We should do them weekly coming into this March board meeting, so we have enough time to work on this out.
Oh, okay, yeah. So we'll see whoever's interested next week. That is March the 10th. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.